On February 8, 2026, something happened in Japan that hasn't happened in 80 years. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi won 316 seats in a snap election she called with just 12 days' notice, making it the biggest single-party landslide since World War II. Now, winning a supermajority in Japan's parliament alone would be a big deal, but what makes this election matter far beyond Japan is what was happening between China and Japan when it took place. Because Takaichi won this mandate in the middle of one of the most serious geopolitical standoffs anywhere in the world right now. The second and fourth largest economies on the planet going at each other harder than they have in decades. And what she's about to do with that enormous power is going to change everything for East Asia, for better or for worse. But to understand why, we need to go back to where this all started. It all begins with one speech that kicked off a chain reaction no one could have predicted. Back in October 2025, that's when Sanae Takaichi became Japan's first female prime minister, and immediately she made it clear she was not going to play it safe. On November 7th, she stood up on the floor of parliament and said something no Japanese prime minister had ever said out loud. She announced that if China attacked Taiwan, it could be an existential crisis for Japan, and that Japan might have to respond with its military. Now, why did that set off alarm bells in Beijing? I mean, doesn't it sound reasonable? Well, it depends on who you ask. First, let's look at the map. Taiwan is literally 110 kilometers from Japan's westernmost islands. Any war there spills right into Japanese waters. But there's a massive difference between thinking it and actually saying it as a prime minister on the record on the floor of parliament. For Beijing, that crossed a serious red line. Taiwan is a core national interest for China, and any outside military involvement is something they have always said they would absolutely not tolerate. What happened next escalated things fast. The very next morning, a Chinese diplomat in Osaka posted this on X. The post got deleted, but by then, everyone had seen it. China's foreign ministry demanded Takaichi retract her comments. Her response was a straight-up refusal without a single word taken back. And that is when things went from bad to, well, you see. What China did over the next 3 months was one of the most aggressive pressure campaigns we have seen from Beijing in years. It started with tourism. China told its citizens to stop visiting Japan. Airlines offered free cancellations. In just 2 months, tourist arrivals dropped from 717,000 to 330,000, which is a 54% collapse. That alone would have been painful, but Beijing was just getting started. The ban on Japanese seafood went back on, supposedly over Fukushima water concerns, but the timing made that pretty hard to believe. Beef exports were frozen, sake shipments started getting stuck at customs. If it had a Japanese label, it wasn't getting through. Then Beijing went somewhere nobody expected. Japanese culture. Tsunemiku exhibitions cancelled. Studio Ghibli shows cancelled. Pokemon tournaments postponed. Over 30 Japanese music artists had their Chinese concerts pulled. Anime, gaming, music, all of it restricted at once. But the economic and cultural pressure was a gentle part. At the same time, China launched live fire drills in the Yellow Sea, sent Coast Guard ships into disputed waters around the Senkaku Islands, which China claims for their own, and sailed an aircraft carrier through the Miyako Strait with over 100 fighter jet sorties. Then came the moment that had defense analysts losing sleep. Chinese jets locked fire control radar onto Japanese F-15s twice in one day. If you're not into military stuff, that's a fighter jet version of pointing a loaded gun at someone's face. And 3 days later, Russia and China flew joint bomber patrols through the exact same strait, just to drive the point home. In January, it went for Japan's biggest weak point. China restricted rare earth exports to Japan. Now here's what a lot of people don't realize. China controls 60% of the world's rare earth mining and 90% of the processing. That's the stuff in your phone, your car, in missile guidance systems. When China restricts rare earths, entire supply chains stop. So in just 3 months, Beijing hit Japan with a tourism collapse, trade freezes, cultural blackouts, live fire military drills, and restrictions on the raw materials Japan needs to build basically everything. So with all this chaos raining down from Beijing, What does Takaichi do? Try to de-escalate? Or maybe find some diplomatic middle ground? Well, she did the exact opposite, and it might be the craziest part of this whole story. See, here's what nobody outside Japan really understood at the time. Takaichi was fighting battles on multiple fronts, not just with China. Her party, the LDP, only had 199 seats, but she needed 233 for a majority. Her coalition partner was threatening the bill on her whenever it felt like it. It seemed like she was probably managing the biggest crisis Japan had faced in years with one hand tied behind her back. On top of all of that, her party's approval rating was sitting at a pretty rough 30%. So, on paper, calling an election looks like political suicide, right? But this is where it gets really interesting, because Takaichi's own personal approval rating was no less than 70%. 70%. The Japanese public loved her even if they couldn't stand her party. And that gap, that is what she bet everything on. She dissolved parliament on January 2023 and called snap elections for February 8, giving the opposition just 12 days to organize a campaign. To put that into perspective, that's the shortest campaign period in Japan's entire post-war history. Now, I know many people would say that's not very democratic by not giving the opposition time to present a real challenge. But regardless of how you feel about her tactics, the results spoke for themselves. When election day hit on Sunday, in the middle of a miserable freezing cold weather, the LDP won an overwhelming 316 seats, which is 68% of the entire lower house. In fact, it was the first time a single party has won a 2/3 supermajority in Japan since World War II. The previous record was 300 seats under Prime Minister Nakasone back in 1986, a record that had stood for 40 years. So Takaichi did more than just beat that record, she absolutely destroyed it. And obviously, the markets love this landslide victory too. The Nikkei 225 rose 4% the very next trading day, hitting all-time record highs. Investors were clearly betting that political stability was back in Japan, and they were putting their money where their mouth was in a big way. So what does Takaichi actually do with all that newfound power? And why does it matter for China and the entire region at large? This is where it gets really interesting. Well, a 2/3 majority means Takaichi can override the upper house, control every committee, and pass literally anything without a single opposition vote. But the big one, the one keeping Beijing up at night right now, probably is that she can now start amending Japan's constitution. Specifically Article 9, the clause that technically says Japan can't have a military. Changing that has been a conservative dream for decades, and for the first time, it's actually possible. Now it's worth pausing here for a minute. Japan actually has something like a military right now, the JSDF, Japan's Self-Defense Forces. But as the name suggests, it's only for self-defense. So, for Japan's neighbors, not just for China, but also South Korea and the others, a Japan that rewrites its pacifist constitution carries a lot of historical weight. This is a country whose military aggression is still remembered in much of Asia. So when we talk about Japan potentially remilitarizing, it's an entire regional headache. In fact, Takaichi is not exactly being quiet about her intentions either. The day after the election, she told reporters this victory gave her a mandate to carry out important policy shifts and that she'll be bold in building a new Japan. She didn't spell out exactly what that means, but let's be frank, the direction seems pretty clear. Now, if you're sitting in Beijing watching this, you can probably see why this is a problem. A Japan that rewrites its pacifist constitution is a completely different Japan. So the very next morning, China's foreign ministry came out and said this: if the far-right forces in Japan misjudge the situation and act recklessly, they will inevitably face resistance from the Japanese people and a resolute response from the international community. And then, once again, China demanded Takaichi take back her Taiwan comments and show sincerity in protecting the China-Japan relations. Now look, you can understand where both sides are coming from here. From Beijing's perspective, a Japanese Prime Minister openly talking about military involvement in Taiwan touches on something they consider a non-negotiable national interest. Taiwan's a red line for them, and they've been very clear about that from the start. But from Tokyo's perspective, a potential conflict 110 kilometers from the territory is very much your business. And now they've got Takaichi, who has no less than 70% public approval backing this position. And after the election results, she's got the strongest electoral mandate in modern Japanese history behind her. So demanding a retraction at this point is, well, it's not going to work. Which, if you're sitting in Beijing, has to be a very frustrating outcome. This leaves both sides in a really difficult position. Escalating further hasn't gotten them anywhere, but quietly dropping the whole thing is politically difficult on their end too. So right now, both sides are kinda locked into positions that are really hard to walk back from. Meanwhile, let's not forget that while everyone was focused on the election drama, Japan was quietly making moves that could matter even more in the long run, especially for China. Because on February 1st, Japan successfully retrieved rare earth-rich mud from a depth of 6,000 meters near Minamitorishima, a remote island way out in the Pacific. Now this is massive because it's a direct response to China's rare earth exports restrictions. The deposits near Minamitorishima are estimated to contain enough rare earth elements to supply Japan for centuries. It's still in the early stages of commercial viability, but the message to Beijing couldn't have been louder. Then there's Philippines. On January 15th, Japan signed a military logistics agreement with the Philippines, covering fuel, ammo, and food sharing. It sounds like nothing on paper, but look at what it creates on the map. A strategic corridor running from Japan through Taiwan down to the Philippines, right along areas where China has maritime ambitions. Beijing views this as a direct challenge to their interests, and frankly, it's hard to argue it isn't. Whether you think it's a necessary defensive measure or aggressive move by Japan depends entirely on where you're standing. So what you're really looking at here is a situation where China's economic leverage over Japan is dropping fast, while Japan's military and diplomatic leverage is growing bit by bit. And the leader at the center of it all just got the strongest mandate in modern Japanese history. That's why it wouldn't be a stretch to say this election is a historic moment for the power dynamics in East Asia. So where does it go from here? Honestly, no one knows. The APEC summit in Shenzhen this November might give both sides a chance to talk, but we know that's 9 months away, and given how fast things have been moving, a lot can change between now and then. The question for both sides is whether they can find a way to de-escalate before this gets genuinely dangerous. Because the old order in East Asia, where everyone danced around disputes and kept things vague, that era seems to be ending. Japan, the country that stayed out of the spotlight for 80 years, just chose a leader who's determined to step into it. And China isn't about to accept that quietly. Something's got to give. The question is what and when. If you made it this far, you already know this channel goes deeper than the headlines. And if you want to learn more about the history between China and Japan that's filled with hatred and bloodshed, you can check out this video right here.